Hey everybody, real quick here. I received an email from one of my listeners who I don't know who's on, who's on Facebook, but they do like to email, which is great because I like to see thought processes that are very articulate, and I like to see people actually considering my information and then trying to find things that are out there that could be a possibility and could be some data that I can use if it's appropriate. There's other thought processes that I'm like, okay, I'm not going to go there, but I appreciate your contribution. But I'm going to explore this one and not explore it in a way where it's going to change my mind, because I already kind of know where my protocol is headed and why. But I want you guys to take a look at this thought process, and then you can determine for yourself what would make sense. So, you know that my thought process about immortality is the fact that your body does mature at a certain point, right? And then it starts degrading, and that's where the death process comes in. And the reason why it degrades is because the cells are dying off. They get mutated and they're dying off, but they're not dying off altogether. They're doing it systematically. And some will die off really fast because it's their vital organs that are being attacked. Others have other, systems in their body that are starting to fall apart, but it's not their vital organs, so they can live in a specific way and still, and they're mutated, but they can still live. But then it's still, eventually, those dying cells will then replicate and then it will attack vital organs, and that's why death happens. That's called the aging process too. Okay, so this young lady, and she has an email that's so it's cute because it's funny, but I'm not gonna say it because I don't want to, I don't want to totally call her out. But let me read this. Okay, so she says, just wondering if you've considered this before, as you talk about immortality often. Have you heard of the immortal jellyfish? And yeah, I have heard of immortal jellyfish. I've heard of a lot of other immortal type of animals, okay? But, animals and humans have very different systems, predicated on the same, type of thing, biochemistry, and there's certain funguses that they need, and then when it gets overabundant. So, we're all very similar. So that's why I considered to read this, because, there's a lot of, organisms all have certain similarities, and there's also differences. Okay, so this is what she wrote. She wrote, Turritopsis dohrnii is now officially known as the immortal creature. The secret to eternal life, as it turns out, is not just living a really, really long time. It's all about maturity, or rather the lack of it. The immortal jellyfish, as it is better known popular, propagates and then faced with the normal career path of dying. They opt instead to revert to a sexually immature stage. It turns out that now let's look at that. It reverts back to, first let's look at maturity. Okay, so let's just circle back to what is maturity. Maturity is when your body is developed to where it's not developing, it's developed. Because when you see a child, right? When you see a child right now in a certain developmental process, it hasn't fully developed yet because they're still learning about the world. Their systems aren't completely 100% because they're growing into what they're supposed to be, whatever their biochemistry, whatever they were originally intended. And that's why you don't stay a baby your whole life. You grow, you mature. Because you're defenseless as a baby. So that's why there is a maturity process. But in humanity, which is very interesting, humanity right now in our society is that we sort of have the body and the mind aligned with the intention. We don't allow kids to go out on their own until they're 18, because there's a certain amount of maturity that they have to learn, whether their body as well as their mind, to be able to fend for themselves. Because if they can't fend for themselves, then they do stupid things. If they don't get taught how to protect themselves, then if they're released too early from the nest, they die. And that's no different than any other organism that has babies. There's a certain period of time to where the mother has to teach the child how to get along in this world so they don't prematurely die. Okay? So maturity is the ability to grow into a point to where you can go out on your own and defend yourself. And it's different for everybody. It all depends upon the background, as well as our biochemistry and their lifestyle and all of that. And those are all the different factors. But in a perfect world, way before we had all these crazy pathogens that matured the body faster than the brain was able to develop the know-how to protect itself, we did have a certain amount of time where the mother and the child were together. Now kids are going out on their own at an earlier age, and they shouldn't be. Some are getting, emancipated, or others are just continuously immature in their brain, and they commit crimes because they haven't fully developed their brain to be able to get along in this world. So anyways, okay, so let's get back here. So then what is sexually immature? So let's read the sentence. The immortal jellyfish, as it is better known popularly, propagate and then face with the normal career path of dying. They opt instead to revert to a sexually immature stage. So in this context, they're going back to a sexually immature state. So they're instead of dying, they're reverting to a lesser of where they were. That's not where we're going. We're not trying to cycle back to a less sophisticated type of lifestyle or thought process. We still have our memories. We still have able to reason. We still already know how to protect ourselves, but we're just keeping ourselves. We're regenerating ourselves so that way we can still keep protecting ourselves. We're not trying to go back to like 15 or 14 or 13 or a baby. That's not what the immortality of the human species. The immortality of the human species is be able to regenerate cells faster than you're degrading them and still keep your thought process that you already have. You're not losing all of what you learned to go back to a sexually immature stage. No, what that actually is in humanity is cell degradation. That's autism. What she actually is pointing out here about the opposite to revert back to a sexually immature stage is she's looking at autism. When someone develops speaking ability and then they lose that over time because the brain is degrading from a mutation. Okay, so let's read on to what else she said. It turns out that once the adult form of the 4.5 millimeter wide species Turritopsis dohrnii have reproduced, they don't die, but transform themselves back into their juvenile polyp state. Their tentacles retract, their bodies shrink, and they sink to the ocean floor and start to cycle all over again. Among laboratory samples, all the adult Turritopsis observed regularly undergo this change. And not just once, they do it over and over and over again. Okay, so yeah, I mean, I appreciate her contribution in her thought process, because it shows that she is trying to find evidence somewhere that's already been substantiated in the animal world, even if it's a fish world, to wrap her mind around what I'm talking about. And that's amazing because it shows that she's thinking. So maybe I can kind of push her into the next level. So we're not trying to revert back. I mean, we don't know what the end result is, because I'm still actively healing. And I'm still dealing with my reproductive system. I'm still dealing with all of that healing process because that was my curse, my affliction. Okay. But I do not see when somebody finally matures to the point of where they're able to protect themselves, and then we do Jilly Juice, we're going to revert back to a sexually immature state. Because sexually immature, what does that actually mean? Well, in the world of the jellyfish, it means that they go back to an infant-like state. They don't die, right? They revert back to a sexually immature state. But what is sexuality? What is reproduction in the human world? It is when your body is dying and it needs to drop seeds to carry the species forward. In that world, they don't drop seeds and they don't mate. That's like I guess that's an asexual type of species where it's able to reproduce in of itself, but it doesn't need another partner. It's able to just kind of regenerate on its own. So that's a different process. Here, what we're doing with humanity is right now when you're like in your 70s and 80s and your body is degrading, now you're taking nutrients that are going to be friendly to your immune system, and you're going to be regenerating cells, which means you're regenerating hormones, regenerating collagen, regenerating all the things that kept you really like in a healthy, strong, vital, energetic type of lifestyle. When you start seeing your body degrade, which is you're starting getting the sicknesses and the colds and the flus and the cancer, disease, and chronic illness, that shows that your body is decaying on a systematic basis. It doesn't just, because remember, the body wants to live. So when you do have attacks on specific parts of your system, you're going to have things in place already to kind of help mitigate the actual death process altogether, unless you're completely overwhelmed by a negative element. So the death process can happen very quickly if you are completely overwhelmed. So, and that means you're in a gas chamber, or, you know, you had a big blunt force object that penetrated your vital organs. Okay. So I appreciate that contribution, but it's not the same thing. We're not trying to go back to when we were like 1 year old. We're not trying to do, what is that? I mean, we're not doing the Benjamin Button type of thing. That's all Hollywood. Since we are what's the opposite of asexual or something? I don't even know if it's called asexual. It's something where it's a name where the organism is able to regenerate by itself without having anything else. So if we need to procreate because our body is dying, we have to have another partner. That's why there's males and that's why there's females. When you have one single organism that depends on itself to replicate, then that's a whole different process. And there's a name for it, but I don't remember what it is. I said it was asexual, but maybe, is that what it is? That could be. That could be what it is. I should Google that now. Hold on, let me Google that. Asexual. What is asexual? Okay, so that's without sexually or, oh yeah, not involved in the fusion of gametes. Each polyp is capable of budding new polyps through asexual reproduction in spring. Right. Okay. So that is what the jellyfish is. It's asexual. Thank you, Charlene. Thank you. Okay. It's asexual. Okay. But we're not asexual organisms. So that's why it's a difference. So even though we are predicated upon a common foundation of life, and there's necessary systems that have to be in play to keep life going, and then there's things that will then take life away, there are still differences. And that's why we're not a jellyfish. That's why we're not a dog. That's why we're not a cat. I mean, that my dog and I have very similar systems, but she doesn't have the ability to reason. She depends upon me. Now, if she goes out there on her own, yeah, she'll fend for herself, but I've domesticated my dog to where her and I have a relationship. We have a symbiotic relationship. You know, she protects me and I make sure she's protected. But when she's out on her own, then she'll be going and killing chickens and eating, you know, whatever and surviving. But we don't want her to do that because it's a very short life out there when you're in the wild. So there's that difference between myself and my dog, but yet her systems, her digestive system and all of her systems, the fact that she has the ability to get cancer, disease, and chronic illness, all the human diseases that are out there, dogs and cats are also being affected by that, which means that their system isn't that different, and there's certain differences, but for the most part, you know, that's why we're able to have a relationship, because we're very similar with a few differences. Okay. So thank you, you know, young lady, for your contribution, because that is something, you know, to consider out there, to look at and explore. And that's why I decided to talk about this, because I've heard about the jellyfish, but in my mind, I already knew, my intuition, I don't want to be compared to a jellyfish, because that means that you don't have the ability to reason. You know, humans are sexual creatures when they need to be. We're not asexual. The reason why we're sexual is because we are on a death trajectory. It's about not creating extinction in the human population. That's why sexuality happens. When you're finally 100% well to where you're on that path to immortality, you're not going to be sexual. But as soon as you start degrading, guess what? Your sexuality is going to kick in. Okay? That's the difference. That's it. Bye.